What's one moment in your life that changed everything in your family?
I never thought my own sister would try to ruin me in front of everyone I care about, but that's exactly what happened, and it hit harder than I ever could have imagined. It started a few weeks before Thanksgiving when I noticed something odd in our family group chat, something I shouldn't have been able to see but somehow did. Messages from my sister saying I was toxic, that I shouldn't even be allowed to come to Thanksgiving, that everyone should know I was impossible to deal with, and that Dad should just leave me out of all family plans. I stared at those words for what felt like forever, my stomach twisting because the people I had trusted, the ones I had always believed would have my back, were now being manipulated by her version of me. A version that was carefully designed to make me look like the villain. I tried to brush it off at first, thinking maybe it was exaggeration, maybe someone would stand up for me, but I didn't need to wait long to realize that no one was going to. The messages were spreading through the family, and soon enough, I started getting calls from distant relatives asking why I wasn't invited, why my seat at the table was suddenly invisible. Every explanation they gave me came with an edge, a little pause, the kind that made it clear they had already made up their minds. I felt the anger start to build, but I also felt something else, a kind of clarity that I hadn't expected. This wasn't just an insult or a slight. This was an opportunity, a moment where I could take control of a situation that had been out of my hands for too long. I thought about all the ways my sister had always leaned on me without acknowledging it, the times she had expected me to bail her out of situations she created, the way she had undermined me in front of Dad and other family members without ever facing consequences. And then I realized that if I wanted justice, if I wanted her to truly understand the consequences of her actions, I couldn't just argue or try to explain myself. I needed to hit back, and not in some petty, obvious way, but in a way that would shake the very foundation of the privileges she had always taken for granted. The first thing I did was start looking at the benefits she and her kids were receiving, the accounts, the trusts, the financial support that was technically under my influence. I had always been the quiet one in control of things no one really noticed, but suddenly that control felt like power, and I knew exactly how I could use it. I spent hours going through the numbers, confirming everything twice, making sure there was no room for mistakes, no way for her to argue or reverse the decisions once I started. Every time I clicked through the approvals, I felt a rush of something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of authority and finally being seen as someone who could act rather than just react. While I was doing this, my sister continued to flaunt herself in the group chat, sending messages that were meant to humiliate me, painting herself as the victim and me as the problem, making little digs about how I couldn't even get along with my own family. She didn't know I could see all of it, and she didn't know I was already taking steps that would change the way everyone saw her from now on. By the time I finished making the first set of changes, the trust fund for her kids had been frozen, her access to certain accounts revoked, and I had started blocking her channels of communication. Every step had to be calculated. There was no room for error because this wasn't just about punishment, it was about sending a message, a clear demonstration that actions have consequences, and that she had underestimated me in a way she would regret. I could feel the tension start to build even before anyone realized what had happened. There were calls to Dad, frantic texts from my sister asking if I knew what was going on, and panicked messages from her friends who were suddenly caught in the middle. I didn't respond to any of it. I just watched, quietly, letting the panic grow without giving a single hint that I was behind it all. The first strike had been simple in execution but devastating in impact, and I could feel the moment when things shifted. No one was in control anymore except me, and that realization was intoxicating. By the end of the week, I had set the groundwork for everything that was coming next. My sister didn't know it yet, and she never would unless I wanted her to. Dad was starting to ask questions, trying to figure out why everything had changed so suddenly, why the plans that had seemed so certain were now unraveling. And I sat back, letting it all unfold, knowing that the next step would bring even more clarity and that I was finally in a position to reclaim not just respect, but dominance in the family dynamic. The first act of revenge had been completed, and as I watched the chaos I had orchestrated, I realized this was only the beginning, that the true storm was just starting to take shape, and nothing would ever be the same again. I knew the first move had shaken my sister, but I also knew it wasn't enough to make her truly understand the consequences of what she had done, so I started planning the next steps carefully, making sure that everything I did would hit harder and be irreversible in a way that would leave her scrambling while I remained untouchable, fully in control of the situation. I spent hours going over every detail of the family finances, every trust, every account, every benefit that had ever been set up for her or her children, making notes on exactly what could be adjusted, revoked, or redirected. All without raising suspicion or leaving any trail that could lead back to me if someone started asking questions. And the more I looked, the more I realized just how much power I already had quietly at my fingertips. Power she had taken for granted her whole life, and power I was about to use in a way that would make her regret ever thinking she could isolate me from the family. I started with the trust funds for her children because I knew that would strike the deepest, hitting her where it hurt the most while also sending a clear signal that her manipulation and lies had consequences, and the process wasn't complicated. But it required patience and precision to make sure nothing could be challenged legally, and I spent an entire afternoon on the phone with lawyers, reviewing clauses, confirming dates, and cross-checking documentation to ensure that every move I made would be airtight, unassailable, and devastating in its effect without me ever having to confront her directly, which was exactly the point, because this wasn't about drama, it was about authority, control, and finally reclaiming a position I had been denied through her lies. As I made the changes, I could feel a mix of satisfaction and anticipation building, knowing that within days the full impact would be realized and she would have no idea how it happened or what she could do to reverse it. And I allowed myself to smile quietly as I imagined the panic she would feel when her first frantic attempts to check balances and access accounts came back blocked or frozen, and I didn't respond to a single text or email she sent during this time, letting the tension grow. Naturally, knowing that the suspense of not knowing who was responsible would eat at her even more than the financial losses themselves, and I also knew that everyone else in the family would start noticing discrepancies, asking questions, and looking for answers. And they wouldn't find any because the move was seamless, discreet, and surgical in its execution. The first reaction came almost immediately, though not from my sister, but from her friends and acquaintances who started calling and messaging, alarmed and confused, trying to figure out what had happened. And then the messages from her grew more frantic and panicked, full of half-formed accusations, pleading questions, and desperate reasoning that she hoped would make me reverse what I had done. All of which only confirmed that I was hitting the right target and that she had underestimated me completely, and I let it play out, observing from a distance as she tried to use every relationship she had to dig herself out, none of which worked, and none of which even hinted at my involvement, because that was the brilliance of this plan. I didn't need confrontation, I needed control, and I had it fully in hand. Every day that passed, her anxiety grew, her public image in the family and extended network began to falter, and Dad started asking questions, trying to piece together the changes, but without concrete evidence, he couldn't intervene. And I ignored his inquiries, letting him slowly understand that the dynamic had shifted and that I was no longer someone who could be sidelined or dismissed without consequence, and it gave me a strange sense of power, knowing that the authority I had quietly accumulated was now being recognized, if not yet acknowledged, by the people who had once doubted me or taken me for granted, and I savored that quietly because this wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about reclaiming the respect and influence I had always deserved. By the time the weekend arrived, my sister's panic had reached its peak, with her sending frantic voicemails and desperate texts to anyone she thought could help her, and I watched it unfold without responding, fully aware that she had no clue who had orchestrated this. And the more I observed, the more I realized that the first strike had been a warm-up for the real lesson, which was coming next, because I wasn't done, and every blocked account, every frozen fund, every unanswered plea was a reminder to her and everyone else that the family hierarchy had shifted and that I was no longer someone to be dismissed or maligned without consequences. And as I closed my laptop that night, I knew the next moves would be even more decisive. irreversible and satisfying, leaving them all wondering how I had managed it and finally showing my sister that no one underestimated me without paying the price. By the time the third week rolled around, I had already seen the panic in my sister's messages evolve into anger, frustration, and disbelief, and I realized that if I wanted the lesson to land fully, I needed to escalate strategically, not recklessly. Because this wasn't about getting even in the moment, it was about establishing a level of control and authority that would make her think twice before ever trying something like this again, and I had spent enough years watching her manipulate situations to know exactly how to push her buttons without giving her any idea that I was the one in control, which made every small move feel like a silent, precise strike that she couldn't see coming. I turned my attention to the family group chat itself, the platform where her lies had spread like wildfire and where her influence had initially started. Because I knew that removing her from the narrative entirely would be just as impactful as cutting off financial access, and I spent hours mapping out every connection, every person she had confided in, and every way she had positioned herself as a victim or as the moral center of the family, carefully crafting a way to dismantle her credibility without any direct confrontation, because if she thought she could discredit me, I wanted to make sure she had no foundation to stand on, and that meant taking control of the conversation, the access, and the perception all at once. The first move was subtle but effective. I began quietly blocking her from communication channels, starting with the ones she used most frequently to reach the family, her private messaging, and social media accounts that were tied to updates about her children and household, and as I did this, I made sure to create alternative lines of communication for those who still needed updates so that the information she had previously controlled no longer went through her, effectively isolating her influence and forcing everyone to interact with me first if they wanted clarity, and I watched as she realized, piece by piece, that she had lost her position at the center of family operations and that no one was relying on her for information anymore, which hit her harder than any direct argument could have. Then came the move that really made her panic, which involved the final cutoff of her children's trust fund access, a measure that I had prepared meticulously, ensuring every document was correct and legally sound so there was no room for reversal. And I executed it quietly, like a shadow moving behind the scenes, knowing that when she tried to check balances or transfer funds, she would be met with sudden dead ends and error messages that would leave her scrambling, confused, and desperate for answers, and every text, every frantic voicemail she sent went unanswered, letting her imagination run wild with possibilities of who could have orchestrated this, all the while reinforcing my position as the person who ultimately controlled the situation. Meanwhile, my sister's narrative about me being toxic had already begun to collapse in subtle but undeniable ways, because people started noticing inconsistencies in her story, questions started being asked. And when those questions were directed at me, I provided clear, calm, factual responses, leaving no room for argument or misrepresentation, and every time someone in the family expressed doubt about her version of events, I maintained composure and let the evidence speak for itself, slowly eroding her credibility in a way that no confrontation or argument could achieve, and it was a relief to see that her own actions, her own lies, were now becoming the source of her trouble, while I remained above the fray, fully in control and untouchable. Dad, who had been quietly observing the chaos, finally started to reach out, sending long messages to my inbox filled with confusion, concern, and attempts to mediate, and I read every one carefully, savoring the fact that he was coming to me, not her, to figure out what had happened and how to fix it, and I decided to respond selectively, offering only enough information to let him know that I had acted, that everything was now under control, and that any reconciliation or discussion would have to start with him acknowledging her behavior and the damage it had caused, because this was no longer about family tradition or polite holiday gatherings, it was about accountability, and I wanted him to understand the full weight of her actions. By the time Thanksgiving was only days away, my sister was panicking, her social media filled with frantic posts, her calls to friends unanswered, and her reputation in the family visibly crumbling, while I remained calm, collected, and fully aware that the final act was approaching and that when it came, it would not just be about taking control of finances or communication, it would be about cementing the consequences of her behavior in a way that could not be ignored, reversed, or denied. And as I looked over everything I had accomplished so far, I felt a sense of power and clarity I had never known before, knowing that the storm I had orchestrated was almost complete, that the next moves would be decisive, and that by the time this was all over, no one in the family would underestimate me again, and the lesson would be unforgettable. By the time the fourth week arrived, I could see that the tension I had been building was starting to reach a critical point, and I knew it was time to take the final steps before the Thanksgiving weekend, when the family would normally come together and the chaos would be unavoidable, because this was not about small victories or petty revenge anymore. It was about ensuring that my sister, her children, and everyone who had allowed her narrative to dominate would recognize the full weight of their actions, and I understood that to do this effectively, I had to strike with precision, patience, and an understanding of how far each person's sense of entitlement had carried them, and I spent hours planning the moves, writing down every step, anticipating every reaction, and making sure that every action I took would feel decisive, unavoidable, and thoroughly justified, leaving them no room to twist the narrative in her favor or blame me for the consequences that had been entirely her own doing. I began by reviewing every benefit that my sister had access to through me, whether financial, professional, or social, and I systematically eliminated each one, making adjustments, cancellations, and redirections that would not only disrupt her immediate plans, but also establish a long-term shift in the power dynamic, and I did it quietly, methodically, and with absolute certainty that no one could challenge the moves legally or socially. Because this was about removing her leverage entirely, and forcing her to confront the reality that her attempts to control, manipulate, and isolate me had backfired spectacularly, and the process was satisfying on a level that was hard to describe, because every calculated decision reinforced my authority and made it impossible for her to continue pretending she was untouchable or that her words had any weight in shaping the family's perception of me. As I carried out each step, I watched her unravel, first in subtle ways, through questions to friends and family about why accounts were blocked, benefits were missing, or access had suddenly disappeared, and then more openly, through panicked calls and frantic messages that I deliberately left unanswered, letting her anxiety build to a crescendo, because the more she tried to fix the situation on her own, the clearer it became that she had lost control completely. And every failed attempt to understand or reverse what I had done only reinforced the point, and I could see the truth of it in the way her confidence faltered, her voice trembled when speaking to others, and her carefully constructed image of authority and moral superiority began to collapse in real time, leaving her exposed, vulnerable, and desperate. Meanwhile, Dad started sending longer, more urgent messages to my inbox, filled with confusion, concern, and a plea for explanation, and I read every single word carefully, choosing my responses strategically, giving him just enough information to understand that the decisions I had made were deliberate, justified, and non-negotiable, but withholding details that would reveal the full scope of my plan. Because part of this process was letting him realize that my sister's actions had consequences that even he could not undo, and that the accountability he had failed to enforce previously was now being enforced in a way that was clear, unavoidable, and entirely under my control. And I watched as his tone shifted from confusion to concern to recognition, as he started to comprehend the reality of the situation and the depth of her manipulation. By the middle of the week, my sister was in full-blown panic mode, desperately trying to reach out to anyone who might help her reverse what had been done, and every call, text, and social media message that went unanswered only reinforced the lesson that I had been teaching her all along, and I allowed her to flail publicly while remaining completely calm and composed, because the power was mine and I was fully aware of it, and there was a strange satisfaction in seeing someone who had tried To isolate me now find themselves isolated, powerless, and desperate, and in the quiet moments between her frantic attempts, I reviewed every step, ensuring that nothing could be undone, that the leverage she had once wielded was gone forever, and that by the time Thanksgiving arrived, she would face the reality that her actions had consequences that were irreversible, public, and undeniable. As the weekend approached, I knew the final confrontation was not going to be necessary because the groundwork I had laid was already visible in every frustrated call, every confused friend, and every urgent message from family members trying to make sense of the chaos, and I felt a clarity I had never experienced before, knowing that I had shifted the balance entirely in my favor, that my sister would never underestimate me again, and that the family, including Dad, had begun to recognize not only the consequences of her choices, but also my authority, control, and strategic brilliance, and as I closed my laptop for the evening, I knew the final act was coming, inevitable, and that it would cement the lesson in a way that no one could ever forget, and the anticipation of that moment was electric, because everything I had built was about to reach its climax, and I was ready for it. Thanksgiving morning arrived with a weight I could almost feel pressing through the walls, but I was calm, composed, and fully aware that everything I had set in motion over the past month was about to come to its final point. And I understood that this was not about confrontation, shouting matches, or empty apologies. This was about a total reversal of the power dynamic, about making it impossible for my sister, her children, or anyone who had sided with her to ignore the reality that she had crossed a line that could not be undone, and every message, every blocked account, and every canceled benefit had led to this moment, creating a scenario where she was no longer able to control the narrative, influence the family, or maintain the illusion of authority she had spent years cultivating, and knowing that, I felt a calm satisfaction, a sense of control I had never experienced before. I started the day by checking my accounts, making sure that every adjustment, every redirection, and every legal measure I had put in place was functioning perfectly. And as I confirmed that nothing could be reversed and that no one could bypass the barriers I had constructed, I realized that my sister's frantic attempts over the past weeks had already begun to crumble the image she had built of herself as the family moral center, because now, with access gone and credibility shredded, she was forced to rely on others for the most basic information about her children, her finances, and her own place in the household, and I could see through the little updates and frantic voicemails that the realization was slowly sinking in, that she had lost, and the lesson I had orchestrated was finally hitting home. By mid-morning, Dad was sending continuous messages to my inbox, trying to understand what had happened, to mediate, and to find some middle ground, and I read every single one with the knowledge that the power had shifted completely, and that for the first time, he was seeking answers from me, not her, because I had removed the foundation of her influence and restored clarity in a way that was undeniable, and I responded carefully, calmly, and strategically, offering just enough information to satisfy curiosity without giving away my methods or showing any weakness, because this was about demonstrating authority and control, about ensuring that the family recognized that the responsibility for the chaos lay entirely with my sister, and that no excuses, manipulations, or emotional appeals could reverse the consequences that had been enforced. The messages from my sister became increasingly frantic, filled with confusion, denial, and attempts to manipulate anyone who might still have sympathy for her situation, but I ignored them, letting the consequences of her own actions speak louder than any words she could send, and I watched as her frantic efforts not only failed but began to expose inconsistencies in her story, making it clear to everyone around her that she had been the instigator of the conflict, that her previous claims about me being toxic were false, and that the truth had always been on my side, and every blocked account, frozen benefit, and removed privilege reinforced that reality, leaving her isolated, powerless, and finally forced to confront the outcome of her manipulations. By late afternoon, as family members began to check in and messages arrived from relatives who had been caught in the middle of her narrative, it became clear that the lesson was complete because everyone was now reaching out to me directly for clarity, for explanations, and for instructions on how to navigate the situation, and I realized that I had not only reclaimed control, but had also redefined the way the family would perceive authority, credibility, and accountability moving forward. And even Dad's tone had shifted from hesitant confusion to reluctant acknowledgement, and I knew that the point had been driven home in a way that could not be reversed, ignored, or diminished. When the day began to wind down, my sister finally sent a message directly, filled with a mix of pleading, anger, and disbelief, and I read it with calm precision, choosing to respond only with confirmation that the access she had lost was permanent, that the consequences of her actions were final, and that any future attempts to manipulate or regain influence would be met with the same resolve. And as I sent that message, I felt the full weight of the power shift, the clarity of justice in my own hands, and the satisfaction that came from seeing someone who had tried to diminish me finally realize the impossibility of reclaiming what she had lost. And I allowed myself to step back, knowing that the storm had passed, the lesson was learned, and that I had executed every step with precision, strategy, and emotional brilliance. By the time evening settled, the family had begun to process the events, with Dad reaching out one last time to acknowledge what had happened, to recognize my authority, and to understand that the boundaries I had established were not negotiable. And I realized that the victory was complete, not because of malice or revenge for its own sake, but because I had enforced accountability, restored fairness, and demonstrated the consequences of deceit in a way that was thorough, undeniable, and deeply satisfying. And as I closed my devices and allowed the day to end, I felt a sense of finality, empowerment, and clarity that confirmed beyond doubt that I had won. The tables had been turned, and the lesson would never be forgotten.